Whenever I work with couples who are planning to get married, one of the things that we talk about in that preparation is what scripture passages they might like to have read at their wedding. And one of the surprising things that we discover in researching that and trying to pick out some verses that are appropriate is that Jesus himself did not have a lot to say about marriage. He talked nonstop about what we should be doing with our money, but he had very little to say about marriage. There is, of course, his first miracle that was performed in the context of the wedding at Cana. And one of the metaphors that Jesus uses the most to describe the kingdom of heaven is that it's going to be like a great wedding feast. But in terms of talking about actual human marriage, Jesus did not have much to say. He did talk about faithfulness in relationships. And in his Sermon on the Mount, he said that even if we lust in our hearts, whether or not we actually act upon that lust, we have still broken the expectation of faithfulness to our partner. And last week, you might recall, Jesus talked about cutting off a hand or plucking out an eye to prevent ourselves from falling into that kind of sin. And then, of course, we have today's gospel reading from Mark, where Jesus says, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." Not actually an inspiring reading for a wedding service, right? This particular gospel reading is the one that I dread the most, having come up in our assigned readings. For this reading has historically been used by churches to shame people who have gotten divorced. I always think about how those words sound harsh to people who have experienced divorce, not only a couple themselves, but also for any children whose parents have been divorced. We even call those broken homes, as if there was no brokenness prior to the divorce. I myself have gone through the trauma of the disillusionment of a relationship and the ending of a marriage. And there was a time in church history when that would have disqualified me from continuing in ordained ministry. And even though we are more enlightened and accepting these days, I would venture to say that most divorced and remarried persons still feel a sense of stigma in church, as though we are somehow second-class Christians. So maybe it will help by examining this reading today more closely. And it's always good to begin by setting the context. Some Pharisees came to see Jesus in order to test him, to trick him. Right away, we know that their motivation was not pure. And Jesus sees through this and wants to expose their hypocrisy, their sense of self-righteousness. In his response, Jesus says that there was no design flaw in God's creation of the world. God created human beings with a yearning to be in relationship with one another. In the creation story in the second chapter of Genesis, God looks at the first human being that God created, and God says that it is not good for this one human being to be alone, all by himself. And therefore, God decides to create a suitable companion for this first person. Now, Christians who are literalists tend to use this particular story in Genesis as justification to shame those humans among us who find their yearning for companionship is focused on someone of their same gender. But I think that's placing the emphasis on the wrong part of the story. The main point is that God created us out of great love for us. And that part of that love is a concern that no one be left alone, isolated. Rather, it is part of God's design that each and every one of us have the opportunity for companionship that is appropriate for who we are. Getting back to the gospel, Jesus references this creation story to reiterate that there is no design flaw in the way that the world has been created. Rather, divorce and brokenness occur in relationships because of the sinfulness of human hearts. And it was in acknowledging the hardness of human hearts that Moses included a loophole in the Jewish law that permitted the option of divorce. Sometimes relationships are so toxic because of that human sinfulness that it is the lesser of two evils to end the relationship rather than destroy the souls of the two individuals and their families. Keep in mind that the Pharisees brought this up in order to trap Jesus. But Jesus exposes their hypocrisy in very clever ways. First, he says that men should only divorce their wives in the case where she commits adultery. And right there, Jesus is passing judgment on the Jewish law of his day, which allowed a man to divorce his wife for things as frivolous as not liking her cooking. The word that's used in the passage Aramaic is to dismiss her, as though throwing away some trash. Now, I've had a lot of people tell me that the way their spouse chews their food drives them crazy. But Jesus is saying that marriage is such an important relationship that it should only be terminated for the most serious of reasons. And then Jesus adds something else. He continues by saying, and if a woman divorces her husband. Now that doesn't sound shocking to our modern ears, but that was simply not an option in Jesus' day. Men could divorce their wives, but women could not divorce their husbands. And so Jesus was exposing another hypocrisy of the Pharisees, that they did not treat women as equals. The Pharisees, for all of their self-righteousness, had the same hardness of heart that all human beings suffer from. We all are sinful and have fallen short of the ideal intention God had in creation of the world and of the first human beings to inhabit it. And then the gospel story ends with people bringing their children to Jesus for a blessing. Some of his disciples tried to stop them in a move that was as self-righteous as the Pharisees had been earlier in the story. And Jesus basically says not to put a stumbling block in anyone's way to prevent them from experiencing the blessings of Jesus. Not because of their age, not because of their gender, not because of their orientation, not because of their ability, not because of their status. We are all created equally as beloved children of God. Amen.